The fluorescent lights in that courthouse always buzzed like angry bees above my head, and my stomach felt like I had swallowed a handful of gravel as I stood there watching my husband of 26 years stroll toward me like he owned the entire building. He stopped just close enough to make me uncomfortable, fixed his cufflinks like he had all the time in the world, and then looked me dead in the eye and said, "You should have taken the first offer, Margaret. Because after today, you will leave with nothing but your name." The woman waiting near the door behind him crossed her arms and laughed softly like it was the funniest thing she had ever heard. I felt my throat tighten. But before my voice could betray me, my lawyer stepped beside me, placed one steady hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "Tell me you followed every single step." He nodded. She tilted her head and gave me the smallest smile I had ever seen carry so much power. "Perfect," she said. "Because he just walked into something he cannot walk back out of. Welcome. And thank you for being here with me today, truly. Before I go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from, because I love knowing who is sitting with me through these stories. My name is Margaret. I am from Tennessee. And I want to tell you right now that I am not a woman who ever imagined standing in a courthouse hallway being told I would leave my own marriage with nothing. When my lawyer whispered those words to me that morning, I did not feel powerful. I felt like a woman who had been holding her breath for 2 years and was finally about to either breathe or drown. But I had done the work. Quietly, carefully, and without tipping a single hand. And that morning, the truth I had gathered was sitting in a folder thick enough to change everything. So I steadied my feet on that cold hallway floor and I waited for the doors to open. My mind did not stay still while I waited. It pulled me backward the way minds do when the present moment feels too heavy to hold. I thought about the woman I was when I first married Gerald. 24 years old, full of plans, working double shifts at the hospital and believing with everything I had that we were going to build something lasting together. I thought about the little apartment we shared with the leaking faucet and the window that would not close all the way in winter. And I remember thinking even then that I did not mind the cold because I believed we were warm in the ways that counted. I gave that marriage everything a person can give. A work, save. I supported his business decisions even when they scared me. And when his accounting firm started growing, I was the one staying up past midnight cross-checking ledgers, writing proposals, and making sure the numbers told a story that attracted the right clients. I never asked for credit. I just believed that what we built together belonged to both of us. But somewhere between the growing business and the nicer car and the dinner parties with people whose names I could barely remember, Gerald started looking through me instead of at me. Not all at once. It happened the way a photograph fades, slowly. So slowly that you keep thinking the image is still there until one day you hold it up to the light and realize the color is almost completely gone. He stopped asking about my day. He stopped reaching for my hand in public. He started answering my questions with a tired look that made me feel like a child who had interrupted something important. And I kept telling myself it was the pressure of the business. I kept telling myself that successful men carry heavy loads and that patience was the most loving thing I could offer. I told myself that for longer than I should have. And while I was being patient, he was being something else entirely. The first real crack appeared on a Tuesday in October when I went to refill our joint savings account, and the teller looked at her screen and then looked at me with an expression I will never forget. Not pity exactly. More like the careful face of someone who does not want to be the one to tell you something. She said the balance was lower than I expected by an amount that made me grip the counter. I smiled at her. Thanked her. I walked to my car and sat there for 40 minutes without starting the engine. The number I had seen did not match anything Gerald had told me about our finances. It did not match any bill. It did not match any investment he had mentioned. It was just gone, moved somewhere quiet, somewhere I was not supposed to look. When I brought it up that evening, keeping my voice as calm as I could manage, he did not even look up from his phone. He said it was a business transfer and that I would not understand the structure of it. Then he told me I was becoming paranoid and that suspicious wives made for exhausting marriages. I remember the way those words landed in my chest, because they were designed to land there. Designed to make me feel small and foolish for noticing something real. I went to bed that night staring at the ceiling, running numbers through my head, and thinking about all the years I had kept that household steady while he focused on the firm. I was not paranoid. I was paying attention. And paying attention, I was beginning to understand, was the most dangerous thing I could do. After that night, I started noticing things I had trained myself not to see. His schedule became vague in a specific kind of way. Not randomly vague, but vague in patterns. Thursday evenings. Occasional Sunday afternoons. Long lunches that left no receipt on his desk. His phone had a new password I had never been told. And sometimes when I walked into a room, he would finish a sentence and then go very quiet in a way that felt rehearsed rather than natural. I did not confront him. Something deep in my gut told me that confronting him too early would only make him more careful. So I kept my face easy and my eyes open. I smiled at dinner. I asked about his day. And I watched. The watching led me somewhere I had not expected. Not to anger first, but to grief. Because there is a particular kind of sadness that comes from realizing the person sitting across your dinner table has built a secret life with the same hands they used to hold yours. One afternoon I found a dry cleaning receipt in the pocket of a jacket I was taking in for him. A woman's scarf had been cleaned along with his shirts. Pale green cashmere. Nothing I owned. Nothing I would have chosen. I held that receipt at the kitchen sink for a long time, the water running cold over my fingers, thinking about how ordinary betrayal looks when you are finally staring directly at it. I did not cry that night. I think I had already cried the tears that belonged to this moment in smaller, quieter ways over the past several months without fully understanding why. What I felt instead was a cold and clarifying kind of stillness. Like when a fog finally lifts and you can see the road clearly for the first time, even though what the road reveals is not what you hoped for. I made myself tea. I sat at my kitchen table. And I made a decision that changed everything. I was not going to confront Gerald until I understood exactly what I was dealing with. Because I had spent 26 years building something with that man, and I was not going to let panic cost me what truth could protect. The next morning, I called a woman my colleague had mentioned once during a lunch break. A family attorney named Patricia who was known for being thorough in a way that made opposing lawyers uncomfortable. I made the appointment without telling a soul. I drove to her office on my lunch hour, and I brought nothing with me that first visit except my own words and a sick feeling in my stomach that had been living there for months. Patricia listened the way good lawyers listen, quietly and completely. She did not fill in my sentences. She did not offer quick reassurances. She just listened. And when I finished, she asked me a question that I was not prepared for. She asked me what my name was attached to. Not what I felt I deserved. Not what seemed fair. But what my name was actually on, legally, officially, provably. I told her what I could remember. She wrote it down. Then she looked at me steadily and said that before I did anything else, before I made a single move or said a single word to Gerald about any of this, I needed to understand the full picture of what we had built together. 'Cause people who hide money, she told me, hide it early. They move it gradually so no single transaction looks dramatic. And by the time you feel the floor shifting, they have already been digging for months. She told me to go home and act normal. To smile and make dinner and fold laundry and say goodnight. And while I was doing all of that, I was going to quietly gather everything I could find. I went home that evening and Gerald was already there, sitting in the living room watching television, a glass of water on the table beside him, looking completely unremarkable. I made dinner. We ate. He talked about a client meeting that had gone well, and I asked the right questions and laughed at the right moments. And the whole time, a new part of me was watching him the way you watch something you are no longer sure is safe. Not with hatred. Not even with anger yet. Just with eyes that had finally stopped pretending. That night after he fell asleep, I sat in the small home office we shared and I began. I started with the filing cabinet in the corner that held years of documents neither of us had opened in a long time. Old tax returns, business registration papers, property records from when we bought the house. And as I worked through the folders quietly with just the desk lamp on, I found things that made my breath go short. Not because they were shocking in isolation, but because of what they meant together. My name was on more than I had realized. Not just the house. There were papers from the early years of the firm, documents I had signed when we were just starting out, when every signature I gave was an act of faith rather than strategy. But faith, I was learning, leaves a paper trail. And paper trails have legal weight. Over the following weeks, I built a system. I kept a small journal in my work bag, the kind that looks like any other notebook, and every evening I wrote down what I had noticed. Mounts. Conversations that felt designed to confuse me. Phone calls he stepped outside to take. The journal became a quiet record of a life being dismantled without my permission. Meanwhile, I was printing bank statements when Gerald was traveling. I was photographing documents before returning them to their folders. I was logging into accounts I had every legal right to access and saving what I found in a place he could not reach. What I found turned the sadness into something harder and more useful. Over 18 months, there had been transfers that did not match any business expense I could trace. Payments to an account I did not recognize. Car lease I had never been told about. And several large withdrawals clustered around the same weekends when Gerald had been away for what he called conferences. I cross-referenced everything. Compared dates. I matched his travel against the withdrawals. And the picture that emerged was not the picture of a man who had simply grown distant. It was the picture of a man who had been planning. I brought everything to Patricia. Every printout, every photograph, every journal entry. I sat across from her desk and watched her go through it all, and I noticed the moment her expression shifted from professional to quietly furious on my behalf. She did not say anything dramatic. She just looked up at me and said, "He thought he had more time than he did." Then she told me about the next steps, about what the documents proved, about what my signatures on those old business papers actually meant in terms of my legal stake in the firm. And I remember sitting there thinking that sometimes the most powerful thing you ever did was something you did 20 years ago without knowing you would one day need it. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday. Gerald left them on the kitchen counter between the fruit bowl and the coffee maker like they were a grocery list. No conversation. No warning. He had simply decided, and he expected me to absorb it the way I had absorbed everything else over the years, quietly and without complaint. I picked up the envelope and looked at it for a long time. Then I put it in my work bag and drove to Patricia's office after work. She read through it and told me his lawyer had been aggressive in the language, framing me as financially dependent, minimizing my contributions to the firm, and asking for a settlement figure that was genuinely insulting given what I had put into that marriage. "Good," Patricia said, and I thought I had misheard her. But she said it again. "Good. Let him be aggressive." Aggressive people show their whole hand because they think they have already won. Over the next several weeks, Gerald became a different version of himself in our house. Looser. Almost cheerful in a way that felt deliberate. Like a man who had already mentally moved into a new life and was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. He started leaving later in the mornings and coming home less. When he was home, he was on his phone or talking to his lawyer in the study with the door closed. And the woman, whose name I had by now learned, started appearing in spaces that felt like a rehearsal for the life he was planning once I was gone. I saw them once at a restaurant 2 towns over. I was not following him. I was meeting a friend for lunch and they were seated near the window, visible from the parking lot. She was wearing a bracelet I recognized from a jewelry brand I had pointed to once in a magazine and Gerald had said was too expensive. I sat in my car and breathed through it. Then I went inside, had lunch with my friend, and did not say a word about what I had seen, because I had learned by then that composure is not the same as weakness. Composure is what you wear when you are carrying something important and you cannot afford to drop it. The hardest nights were the quiet ones when the house felt too big and the future felt impossible to picture. I would sit with my papers at the dining table and the weight of it all would press down on me like something physical. Not just the divorce. Not just Gerald. But the grief of watching something you built with your own hands be treated like it meant nothing. I cried more than once over those weeks. Not dramatically. Just the ordinary kind of crying that happens when you are genuinely exhausted by what life is asking of you. And after each time, I wiped my face, sharpened my pencil and kept going. Because I had come too far to let grief make my decisions for me. Patricia called me 2 weeks before the hearing with an update that made me sit down on my stairs. During her investigation, Her financial expert had traced money that Gerald had been moving since before he ever told me the marriage was in trouble. A full 14 months before he left those papers on the counter, funds from the firm had been quietly redirected. Not in one obvious movement but in careful, patient increments. The kind of increments that assume no one is paying attention. The kind that count on a wife being too trusting to look. I thought about all the dinners during that 14-month period. All the normal evenings. All the times he had kissed my forehead before bed. And I felt something shift permanently in my understanding of who I had been living with. The night before the hearing, I did not sleep well. I lay in the dark listening to the house breathe around me. The creak of the floors. The hum of the refrigerator. The particular silence of a home that has seen too many hard things and absorbed them all into its walls. I thought about the very first night Gerald and I had slept in this house. How we had sat on the floor eating takeout because the furniture had not arrived yet. How we had laughed about something I could not even remember anymore. And I thought about how much life had happened between that floor and this ceiling. And I let myself feel the sadness of it fully. Not to be swallowed by it but to honor it. Because 26 years deserves more than bitterness. Even when it ends like this. In the morning I dressed with care. Not to impress anyone. Not to compete with the woman who would be sitting in that courtroom beside my husband. I dressed for myself. For the version of me who had kept going when keeping going felt impossible. I chose a blouse I had always felt confident in. Brushed my hair back simply. And looked at myself in the mirror for a long quiet moment. I told myself that whatever happened inside those courtroom walls today, I had told the truth. I had done the work. And no one, not Gerald, not his lawyer, not the woman with the cashmere scarf, could take that from me. Patricia was waiting outside the courthouse when I arrived. She was reading something on her phone, and when she looked up at me, she gave a brief, businesslike nod that somehow steadied my entire nervous system. We walked in together. The lobby of the courthouse had that particular government building smell, something between old paper and cleaning solution, and the floors echoed with every step. Other people moved around us with their own heavy business, their own folders, their own versions of this same kind of day. And I found something almost comforting in that. The reminder that heartbreak is not unusual, that courts exist because lives are complicated, and that the system, at its best, is supposed to see the truth. Gerald arrived 7 minutes after we did. I know because I watched the door. He walked in with his lawyer on one side and the woman on his other, and I noticed immediately that he had dressed like this was a ceremony he expected to win. Everything about his posture said he had already decided how today would end. He spotted me across the lobby and made a point of walking toward me. Not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. And he said what he said. Close enough for me to smell the same expensive cologne he had started wearing around the time the transfers began. You should have taken the first offer, Margaret. Because after today, you will leave with nothing but your name. And the woman behind him smiled like she was watching something entertaining. When Patricia asked me if I had followed every step, I said yes. 'Cause I had. Every printout. Every journal entry. Every date I had written down at midnight with shaking hands. Every account I had documented before the statements were redirected. Everything I had gathered in quiet, careful months while he assumed I was simply grieving and complying. She nodded and said what she said. And those words, those few small words, rearranged something in my chest. Because they told me that all those months of discipline and patience and choosing truth over reaction were about to mean something. The show was starting. And I had not walked in empty-handed. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Pale wood paneling and institutional lighting and chairs that were clearly not designed for comfort. Gerald's lawyer was already setting up on the opposite side. A neat stack of folders, a legal pad, a confident way of moving through the space that suggested he had done this many times and expected to do it again many more. Patricia settled our materials without rushing. She was the kind of lawyer who moves like she is never surprised. And watching her, I felt the tightness in my chest ease just slightly. Not because I was certain of the outcome, but because I was certain she was prepared. And preparation, I had learned over these months, is the most reliable form of courage. Gerald's lawyer went first. He was polished and practiced, the kind of man who knows how to make something unfair sound entirely reasonable. He spoke about Gerald's business as though I had never touched it. He spoke about our finances as though I had simply been a passenger in a vehicle Gerald had built and driven alone. He described my role in our marriage in language that was technically accurate in the way that leaving out half of a story is technically accurate. I kept my hands flat on the table in front of me and breathed slowly and did not react. Because Patricia had prepared me for this. She had told me that his lawyer would try to make me feel invisible. And that the best thing I could do was sit with the knowledge that invisible is not the same as absent. When Patricia stood up, she did not raise her voice. She did not make a speech. She simply walked to the front of that room with our folder and began. She started with the business. Specifically, with the documentation from the early years of Gerald's firm. The papers I had signed. The records that bore my handwriting. The financial entries I had made during the years when the firm was finding its footing, and every careful decision had been a joint one. She laid them out for the judge one at a time, clearly without drama. And with each document, the story Gerald's lawyer had just told began to look less like a story and more like a version. Then she moved to the financial records, the transfers, the withdrawals, the 14 months of quiet repositioning that Gerald had believed went unnoticed. She walked the judge through each one with dates and amounts and corresponding evidence. She did not editorialize. She did not call Gerald names or speak about him with anger. She simply presented what had happened and let the numbers speak in the clear, flat language that numbers speak when they are true. Across the room, I watched Gerald's posture change. Not dramatically. Not in a way the room would necessarily notice. But I noticed the slight forward shift. The jaw that was working without producing words. The hands that had been so relaxed now pressing flat on the table in front of him. The girlfriend, to her credit, went very still. The confident tilt of her chin lowered by degrees as Patricia continued. And I noticed her eyes move to Gerald once or twice as if looking for reassurance. He was no longer in a position to provide. The judge's face was composed and unreadable in the way of judges who have learned to keep their reactions internal. But she was reading every document Patricia placed before her. And there is a particular quality of attention that tells you when someone is truly absorbing what they are seeing versus processing it for form. She was absorbing it. Patricia placed the final set of documents on the judge's desk and stepped back. These were the records from the account I had not known about. The one the transfers had been moving toward. 18 months of deposits that totaled a number I had only learned 3 weeks before when Patricia's financial expert had finished tracing them. The number was significant. Significant enough that when the judge read it, she looked up at Gerald with an expression that had finally shifted from careful neutrality into something quieter and more deliberate. His lawyer leaned toward him and whispered something. Gerald's face had gone from confident to careful in the span of 1 hour. And careful, I had learned, is what confident looks like when it starts to understand it has made a mistake. There was a recess. Gerald's lawyer requested it, and it was granted. During the break, Patricia walked with me to a bench in the hallway and handed me a paper cup of water and told me I was doing well. I asked her how she thought it was going, and she tilted her head in a way that said better than he expected and left it at that. Across the hall, I could see Gerald speaking rapidly to his lawyer. The woman was standing a little apart from them, her arms folded now, her expression difficult to read. She looked like someone who had arrived expecting a party and was beginning to understand that she had dressed for the wrong occasion. When we returned to the courtroom, something had shifted in the temperature of the room. Not physically, but in the way energy changes when one side of an argument loses its certainty. Gerald's lawyer made several adjustments to his position during the second half of the hearing. Language that had been absolute became qualified. Claims that had been presented as facts became described as perspectives. And I watched with something I could not quite name. Not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of recognition. The recognition of a person seeing the truth finally take up the space it had been denied. The judge spoke at the end with the measured, unhurried tone of someone who has drawn a conclusion and is taking care to state it precisely. She acknowledged my contribution to the marriage. She acknowledged my documented role in building the firm. She addressed the financial transfers directly and described them with a word I will not repeat here, but that made Gerald's lawyer press his lips together and write something quickly on his legal pad. And then she spoke about the settlement. When she named the figure, I kept my face forward. I kept my hands flat on the table. But inside, something very old and very tired finally sat down and rested. Gerald did not look at me when it was over. He gathered his things with movements that were controlled in the particular way of a man who is preventing himself from showing how he feels. His lawyer spoke to him quietly, and he nodded without appearing to hear. The woman touched his arm, and he moved slightly away from her hand in a way that I do not think he intended anyone to notice. Noticed. Patricia placed her hand briefly on my arm and said, "That's done." Not triumphantly, just cleanly. The way you say something when it is true, and that is enough. In the parking lot afterward, I sat in my car for a while before starting it. I did not feel like celebrating. I did not feel like crying either. I felt something I had not felt in so long that it took me a moment to identify it. Felt like myself. Like the version of Margaret who had existed before she started making herself smaller to fill a space she was always too large for. I thought about Patricia's voice in that hallway. The show starts now. And I thought about how the show, in the end, had not been a performance at all. It had been the truth. And the truth had simply been asked to stand in a room where someone had the authority to hear it. I want to tell you something that I learned through all of this. Not as a lesson I planned to teach, but as something that settled into me like a stone settling to the bottom of water. The most important thing I did in those 2 years was not the smartest financial move or the most strategic legal decision. It was the decision to keep going when keeping going felt like the loneliest thing in the world. There were nights when I sat with those papers and thought about how much easier it would be to accept whatever Gerald offered just to make the whole thing stop. And every time I had to remind myself that easier is not the same as right. And that a woman who has given 26 years of her life to something has earned the right to stand in a courtroom and be counted. I am not telling you this story to make Gerald into a villain, though what he did was wrong in ways I will carry for a long time. I am telling you this story because I know there are women listening right now who are sitting in quiet houses with questions they are afraid to ask out loud. Women who are watching money disappear and being told they are paranoid. Women who are being made to feel that their years of contribution amounted to nothing. And I want those women to hear this clearly. Your name on a document is not nothing. Your signature on a paper from 20 years ago is not nothing. The work you did that no one applauded is not nothing. It is evidence. It is legal weight. It is the truth that survives even when someone has spent months trying to bury it. After the hearing, I drove home the long way. Past the neighborhood where Gerald and I had gone to look at houses before we found ours. Past the park where we used to walk on Sunday mornings before Sunday mornings became something I spent alone. I let myself feel all of it. The grief and the relief and the strange, uncomfortable freedom of a life that is finally honest again, even if it is also smaller than it used to be. I pulled into my driveway and sat looking at my house. And I thought about how I was going to repaint the front door, a color Gerald had always vetoed. Something bright and a little bit brave. If you are going through something like this, or if you are just beginning to feel the floor shift beneath your marriage, I want you to know that the most powerful thing you can do right now is pay attention. Not out of suspicion, not out of bitterness, but because you deserve to understand the life you are living. Write things down. Ask questions. Find someone you trust and tell them the truth. And if you are afraid that what you discover will be too hard to face, remember that the truth, however difficult, is always better than a comfortable lie that slowly takes everything from you. You are not paranoid for noticing. You are not dramatic for asking. You are a person who deserves honesty. And you are worth fighting for. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. It means more than I can say to know that you are out there listening. If this reached something in you, please leave a comment below. Tell me what you are thinking. Tell me where you are in the world. Share this with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you are new here, welcome to Auntie's Stories, where we tell the truth about the things that matter most. I will see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves.